Gunfire and blood money rarely prepare a man for the way a single sentence can shatter his ironclad defenses. When a ruthless syndicate heir brought his unforgiving mother to a Manhattan bistro, he expected a quiet dinner. Instead, a tired waitress spoke flawless words that altered both their destinies forever. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of La Hora, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of white truffles, aged Barolo, and the quiet hum of unimaginable wealth. Chloe Bennett adjusted the collar of her starch-stiff uniform, her feet aching from an 8-hour shift that had already stretched into 10. She wasn't supposed to be working the VIP section tonight. She was only 24, burying herself in double shifts to chip away at a mountain of inherited debt, trying to keep her younger brother, Arthur, breathing for another month. The heavy mahogany doors at the front of the restaurant swung open, and the atmospheric chatter in the room instantly died. Lorenzo Vitiello did not walk into a room. He commanded it to submit. He was 32, sharply dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that hid the lethal tension in his shoulders. As the reigning head of the Vitiello family, a syndicate that controlled shipping ports from New York to Palermo, Lorenzo carried a dangerous, quiet gravity. But tonight, he wasn't flanked by his usual enforcers. He was escorting a woman who looked equally formidable, if a fraction of his size. His mother, Caterina. Caterina Vitiello was a phantom in the modern underworld. Widowed young, she had ruthlessly guided her son to the throne, and her standards were notoriously impossible. She wore a tailored black dress, a string of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone, and an expression of utter disdain as she surveyed the restaurant. "Mr. Vitiello," the maitre d' stammered, rushing forward so fast he nearly tripped over his own polished shoes. "Your regular table is waiting. Please." Chloe stood by the service station, gripping her serving tray. She watched as Lorenzo guided his mother to the secluded corner booth. He pulled out her chair with practiced grace, murmuring something in a low, hushed tone. Even from a distance, Chloe could see the exhaustion behind Lorenzo's dark eyes. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a crumbling empire, playing the dutiful son while wolves circled his territory. When the regular waiter for the section, a nervous young man named Simon, approached their table, disaster struck almost immediately. Caterina barely glanced at the menu. She began to speak in a rapid, razor-sharp dialect of Sicilian, not the standardized Italian taught in universities, but the thick, colloquial tongue of the old country, laced with idioms and impatience. She was inquiring about the origin of the veal, demanding to know if the chef understood the traditional preparation of vitello tonato. Simon blinked, his face draining of color. "I apologize, ma'am. Let me get the chef. We have an excellent filet." "Idiota," Caterina muttered, shaking her head in disgust. She looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Madre, please, just order in English. He doesn't understand. If he serves Italian food, he should understand the soul of it," she snapped back in her native tongue. "I have half a mind to burn this kitchen to the ground." Simon stood frozen, terrified by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The maître d' was nowhere to be found. Without thinking, driven by a desperate need to diffuse the tension before her coworker lost his job, or worse, Chloe stepped forward. She walked gracefully to the table, picking up the fallen napkin and replacing it with a fresh one. She didn't look at Lorenzo. Instead, she locked eyes with the terrifying matriarch. "Mi scusi, signora," Chloe said, her voice steady, melodic, and perfectly accented. "Il vitello non è all'altezza dei suoi standard. Lo chef usa un taglio troppo magro per la vera tradizione. Se posso suggerire, Il branzino è stato pescato oggi, preparato esattamente come lo farebbero a Siracusa, con capperi e limone di Sorrento. Excuse me, madame. The veal is not up to your standards. The chef uses a cut too lean for true tradition. If I may suggest, the sea bass was caught today, prepared exactly as they would in Syracuse, with capers and Sorrento lemon. Silence fell over the table. A heavy, absolute silence. Katerina froze, her dark eyes narrowing as she scrutinized the exhausted waitress standing before her. She looked at Chloe's cheap uniform, her scuffed shoes, and the faint dark circles under her eyes. Sei Americana, Katerina said softly, suspiciously. You are American. Nata qui, si, Chloe replied with a gentle, respectful tilt of her head. Ma mio padre mi ha insegnato che la lingua è l'unico paese che non puoi mai perdere. Born here, yes, but my father taught me that language is the only country you can never lose. A slow, genuine smile broke across Caterina Vitiello's hardened face, a sight that seasoned Mafia capos had never lived to see. The sea bass, then, Caterina said in heavily accented English, her tone entirely transformed. And a bottle of your best Greco di Tufo, Chloe nodded. Right away, ma'am. As she turned to leave, Chloe accidentally met Lorenzo's gaze. He was staring at her as if she had just materialized out of thin air. The dangerous, cold exterior was fractured, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His dark eyes catalogued every inch of her face, burning with an intensity that made the breath catch in Chloe's throat. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw, and before Chloe could walk away, she heard him murmur under his breath in a voice like gravel and velvet. Cristo, mi hai appena rubato il cuore. Christ, you just stole my heart. Chloe's pulse skyrocketed. She pretended not to hear, rushing back to the kitchen, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the order slip. She knew exactly who Lorenzo Vitiello was. Everyone in the city knew. He wasn't a man who made romantic declarations. He was a man who destroyed things. And now, she had his attention. 3 days passed. Chloe convinced herself that the encounter at La Ora was nothing more than a surreal blip in her otherwise chaotic life. Lorenzo had left a staggering $5,000 tip on the table that night, folded neatly beneath a minimalist black business card. It bore no name, only a phone number and a crest embossed in silver. She had hidden the card in her dresser, terrified of what it represented. She didn't want the underworld. She already had enough of it. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had been a brilliant linguist and a ghost in the criminal ecosystem. For 20 years, he translated intercepted communications and brokered backroom deals between the Italian cartels and the Russian mob. He kept his family in the dark, insisting Chloe learn the dialects of his clients purely for the sake of cultural appreciation. When Thomas died abruptly of a heart attack a year ago, the truth came out. He hadn't just left behind books and dictionaries. He had left behind a massive, unpayable debt. Worse, Chloe's younger brother, Arthur, had tried to fix the financial ruin by gambling at underground casinos run by the Rossetti Syndicate, the Vitiello's most bloodthirsty rivals. On a frigid Thursday night, Chloe arrived at her cramped Queens apartment to find the door splintered off its hinges. Panic seized her throat. She dropped her bag and sprinted inside. The apartment was trashed. Furniture was overturned, cushions slashed, and in the center of the living room lay Arthur, his face a bruised, bloody mess. He was clutching his ribs, groaning in agony. "Arthur!" Chloe screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. She grabbed a towel from the kitchen, pressing it to a deep laceration above his eye. Who did this? Was it Silas Rossetti's men, Arthur coughed, spitting a mixture of saliva and blood onto the cheap carpet. They said time's up, Chloe. 50,000 by Monday, or they'll put me in the East River, and they said they'd take you as collateral. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over her. $50,000. She might as well try to pluck the moon out of the sky. She had drained her savings, maxed out her credit cards, and the restaurant wages barely covered rent. She had nowhere to turn. No police would help them. Involving the authorities with the Rossetti family was a guaranteed death sentence. Her mind raced, desperately searching for an exit. Then, a memory surfaced. A black card, a silver crest. "Stay here," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm going to fix this." The next morning, Chloe stood outside a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district, Vitiello Global Logistics. It was the legitimate, sunlit face of a profoundly dark empire. She gripped the black card in her pocket like a talisman, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was walking into the lion's den, but it was the only way to save her brother from the wolves. She approached the sleek reception desk. "I need to see Lorenzo Vitiello." The receptionist didn't even look up from her monitor. "Do you have an appointment?" Chloe placed the black card on the marble counter. "He left this for me." The receptionist's eyes darted to the silver crest, her demeanor instantly shifting from bored to hyper-alert. She picked up a phone, dialed a single digit, and whispered into the receiver. Less than 2 minutes later, a massive man in a tailored suit, Lorenzo's head of security, stepped out of the elevator and escorted Chloe up to the penthouse level. The doors opened into an office that looked like a modern fortress. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he owned. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Lorenzo. He looked up from a stack of dossiers, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The raw, predatory focus in his gaze was exactly as she remembered. He waved a hand, and the security guard vanished, closing the heavy oak doors behind him. "Chloe Bennett," Lorenzo said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to vibrate in the expansive room. He already knew her name. Of course he did. "I wondered if you would ever use that card, though I admit, I didn't expect to see you looking like you're marching to the gallows." Chloe stood tall, refusing to let her hands shake. "I need your help, Mr. Vitiello, and I am willing to pay for it. Not with money, because I don't have any, but with my skills." Lorenzo leaned back, steepling his fingers. "My mother hasn't stopped talking about you. She insists I hire you to replace her translator, whom she recently fired." He didn't elaborate on how the previous translator was fired, and Chloe didn't want to know. "But you didn't come here for a job interview, did you?" "My brother owes $50,000 to Silas Rossetti," Chloe said, deciding that blunt honesty was the only weapon she had left. "His enforcers broke into my apartment last night. They nearly killed him. They threatened me. I need the debt cleared." Lorenzo's expression darkened at the mention of Rossetti. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The Rossettis are animals, but 50,000 is a significant favor to ask of a man you met once over a plate of sea bass." "My father was Thomas Bennett," Chloe countered, playing her final, desperate card. Lorenzo's eyes widened slightly, a rare crack in his impenetrable facade. He stood up slowly, walking around the desk until he was standing mere inches from her. He smelled of bergamot and danger. "Thomas Bennett, the ghost. He was your father?" "Yes," Chloe whispered, holding her ground despite the overwhelming urge to step back from his intense proximity. "He taught me everything. Every dialect, every code. I know you're expanding into the ports in Palermo. I know the local families there don't trust outsiders, and they definitely don't trust standard Italian lawyers. They speak in codes, in dialects that take a lifetime to master. I can be your voice there. I can read the ledgers my father left behind. Buy my brother's debt, keep him safe, and I belong to you until the debt is paid." Lorenzo stared down at her, his jaw clenching. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the side of her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle for a man with so much blood on his hands. "You belong to me," he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue with a dark, possessive weight. "You have no idea what you're offering, Chloe." "I know exactly what I'm offering," she lied, her pulse racing as his thumb traced her jawline. Lorenzo stepped back, pulling out his phone. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving hers. "Silas? It's Vitiello. The Bennett boy's debt. It's mine now. If your dog so much as look at his sister again, I will personally burn your establishments to the ground. Are we clear?" He hung up, tossing the phone onto the desk. "It's done," Lorenzo said softly. "Your brother is safe. But you and I, we are going to Sicily. And you are going to pretend to be my fiancé. The old families won't do business with a bachelor, and they won't trust a hired translator. They will only trust family." Chloe's breath hitched. "Fiancé?" "Yes," Lorenzo replied, stepping into her space once more, the undeniable chemistry between them crackling like electricity. "And given how effortlessly you stole my mother's heart and my own, it shouldn't be too difficult of a performance. Pack your bags, amore mio. Our flight leaves tomorrow." Sunlight pierced the cabin of the Gulfstream G650 as it descended toward Falcone Borsellino Airport. Chloe stared out the window, the rugged coastline of Palermo materializing through the morning mist. She had spent the last 8 hours suspended in the clouds, trapped in a luxurious leather seat across from a man who was equal parts terrifying and magnetic. Lorenzo had barely slept, his attention consumed by encrypted tablets and hushed phone calls in rapid Italian. "Nervous?" Lorenzo's voice broke the ambient hum of the jet engines. He closed his laptop, rubbing the tension from his jaw. He had discarded his suit jacket hours ago, the sleeves of his crisp white shirt rolled up to reveal a network of faded scars and intricate ink on his forearms, reminders that his empire was built on violence before it was built on commerce. "Terrified," Chloe admitted, gripping the armrests. "I've translated wiretaps and old letters, Lorenzo. I've never sat in a room with the Cosa Nostra and pretended to be a mob boss's future wife." Lorenzo leaned forward, his dark eyes softening a fraction. "You won't be dealing with the street soldiers, Chloe. We are meeting with Don Salvatore Leone. He is of the old guard, a man who values respect, family, and tradition above all else. He controls the shipping routes we need. You are here to bridge the gap my father couldn't. Just follow my lead." Hours later, a fleet of armored black Range Rovers delivered them to the historic Via Igia. The luxury hotel, perched on the edge of the Tyrrhenian Sea, was a masterpiece of Art Nouveau architecture. But Chloe barely had time to admire the terraced gardens or the sparkling azure water. They were escorted to the presidential suite, a sprawling expanse of marble floors, antique chandeliers, and silk drapery. The immediate problem, however, was the singular, massive, king-sized bed dominating the master bedroom. Chloe stopped in the doorway, her suitcase clutched in her hand. "Don't panic," Lorenzo murmured, stepping up behind her. His chest brushed against her shoulder, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I'll take the sofa in the study, but we must share the suite. Salvatore has eyes everywhere, including the hotel staff. If we book separate rooms, the engagement is a lie, and the deal is dead before we even sit down." He moved past her, casually tossing his watch onto the mahogany dresser. Get changed. We have a private dinner with Salvatore at his estate in Mondello in 2 hours. Wear the emerald dress my mother sent over. The dress was a weapon in itself, a floor-length silk gown that clung to Chloe's curves and left her back entirely bare. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, her dark hair pinned in a sleek twist, Lorenzo stopped dead in his tracks. The cold, calculating syndicate head vanished, replaced by a man struck entirely speechless. He approached her slowly, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. "If you are going to be my fiancé," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave, "you need the armor to prove it." He opened the box, revealing a massive, emerald-cut diamond ring flanked by sapphires. It was heavy, cold, and breathtaking. As he slid it onto her trembling finger, his thumb lingered on her skin. "Remember," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips, "tonight, you are completely, irrevocably in love with me." The Leone estate in Mondello was a fortress disguised as a coastal villa. Armed guards in tailored suits patrolled the perimeter, their eyes scanning the Vitiello vehicles as they pulled through the iron gates. Dinner was a master class in psychological warfare. Don Salvatore was a man in his late 70s, with skin like cured leather and eyes that missed nothing. He sat at the head of a massive dining table, flanked by his 2 sons, Matteo and Vincent, who looked at Lorenzo with thinly veiled contempt. For the first hour, the conversation was strictly social, heavily laced with Sicilian idioms designed to test Lorenzo's roots. Lorenzo held his own, but the tension was a physical weight in the room. Then, Salvatore turned his predatory gaze to Chloe. "E questa bella creatura?" Salvatore rasped, swirling his wine. "Un'americana. Il sangue dei Vitiello si sta diluendo, Lorenzo. And this beautiful creature? And American. Is the Vitiello blood diluting, Lorenzo?" Lorenzo's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Chloe placed a gentle hand over his. She smiled a warm, respectful, and perfectly calibrated expression. "Il sangue americano può essere nuovo, Don Salvatore," Chloe replied flawlessly, using the specific, formal Palermo dialect her father had drilled into her. "Ma la lealtà che porto a Lorenzo è antica come le pietre di questa terra. La vera forza non sta solo nel mantenere le vecchie tradizioni, ma nel sapersi adattare per proteggerle. The American blood may be new, Don Salvatore, but the loyalty I bear to Lorenzo is as ancient as the stones of this land. True strength lies not only in keeping old traditions, but in knowing how to adapt to protect them." Salvatore's sons stared at her in shock. Even Lorenzo looked momentarily stunned. Salvatore, however, threw his head back and let out a booming laugh. "She has fire," the old Don declared, switching to English out of sheer amusement. Thomas Bennett raised a sharp daughter. "Yes, I know who you are, child. Your father was a legend among ghosts. It is a shame about his outstanding debts." Chloe's blood ran cold. How did he know about the debt? Across the table, Matteo leaned forward, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "We hear Silas Rossetti is very upset you took his leverage, Lorenzo. Silas is a good friend of ours. It makes us wonder, are we doing business with the Vitiellos? Or are we making enemies of the Rossettis for a woman who is nothing more than a purchased asset?" Lorenzo's hand tightened around his wine glass until Chloe thought the crystal would shatter. "Chloe is not an asset," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper that silenced the room. "She is my future wife, and if Silas Rossetti or anyone else has an issue with my family, they can bring it to me directly. But I assure you, they will not survive the conversation." The dinner concluded shortly after, The business negotiations postponed to the following day at a vineyard in Marsala. As they rode back to the Villa Igia in silence, the adrenaline faded, leaving Chloe shaking. In the safety of their suite, Lorenzo poured 2 glasses of scotch. He handed her one, his expression unreadable. "You were incredible tonight," he said softly. "But Salvatore knows too much. The Rosettas have infiltrated Palermo." "Lorenzo," Chloe started, the alcohol burning her throat. "My father didn't just translate for the mob. Before he died, he told me he hid a master ledger, a book containing the offshore accounts and blackmail material of every major syndicate on the East Coast. I thought he was hallucinating from the painkillers. But Silas Rossetti didn't want $50,000 from my brother. He wanted the ledger. He thought Arthur had it." Lorenzo froze, staring at her. "And do you have it?" Chloe nodded slowly. "It's locked in a safety deposit box in Manhattan. The key is sewn into the lining of the winter coat I left in my apartment." Lorenzo swore violently in Italian, raking a hand through his dark hair. "Rossetti isn't just trying to collect a debt. He's trying to control the entire commission. If Salvatore Leone allies with Silas, they will slaughter my family and take the ports by force." He stepped closer to her, his chest rising and falling heavily. "I promise to protect your brother. I promise to protect you. I am not going to break that vow." Before Chloe could process the intensity in his eyes, Lorenzo closed the distance between them. He cupped her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, and kissed her. It wasn't the calculated, performative kiss of a fake fiancé. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply real. Chloe dropped her glass, the crystal shattering on the marble floor as she tangled her hands in his hair, kissing him back with a fierce, unexpected hunger. The morning sun over Marsala was deceptively bright, casting a golden glow over the sprawling vineyards where the Leone family conducted their illicit affairs. Chloe stood beside Lorenzo on the dusty terrace of a stone farmhouse, the warm Mediterranean breeze doing nothing to calm her racing heart. Today was the final negotiation. If Lorenzo secured the shipping routes, the Vitiello family would solidify their dominance, making them untouchable even to Silas Rossetti. If they failed, the alliance between Leone and Rossetti would spell a death sentence for Lorenzo, Chloe, and her brother Arthur back in New York. Lorenzo wore a tailored black suit, discarding the tie for a more relaxed look that starkly contrasted with the heavy Beretta 9mm concealed at his hip. He didn't look like a man walking into a trap. He looked like a king, inspecting his lands. "Stay behind me today," Lorenzo murmured, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. His touch burned through the thin fabric of her sundress, a vivid reminder of the shattered boundaries between them the night before. "Translate exactly what they say, but watch Matteo. He is the weak link. He's greedy, and greedy men leak information through their body language." "I know," Chloe whispered back. "My father used to say the loudest man in the room is the one hiding a knife." The heavy wooden doors of the farmhouse creaked open, and Don Salvatore emerged, flanked by Matteo, Vincent, and half a dozen armed guards. A long oak table had been set up under a canopy of grapevines, littered with maps, shipping manifests, and carafes of local red wine. They sat down, the pleasantries completely absent this time. Salvatore began speaking rapidly in Sicilian, detailing the extortionate percentage he wanted from the Vitiello cargo moving through his ports. Chloe translated seamlessly, but her eyes darted between the men. She noticed Matteo continually checking his watch, his foot tapping nervously against the cobblestones. Vincent was completely silent, his hand resting suspiciously close to the inside of his jacket. Don Salvatore richiede il 40% dei profitti sui container in transito. Chloe relayed to Lorenzo, translating the exorbitant 40% demand. Lorenzo scoffed. Tell the Don that 20% is my final offer. I am bringing him business he could never secure himself. I am not his vassal. As Chloe translated Lorenzo's counteroffer, she caught a specific, localized slang word. Matteo muttered under his breath to Vincent, I corvi stanno atterrando. The crows are landing. Chloe's blood turned to ice. It was a phrase her father had documented in his journals. It wasn't a casual remark. It was a specific operational code used by the Rossetti Syndicate to signal an impending ambush. She didn't miss a beat. She turned to Lorenzo, maintaining a perfectly composed smile, and spoke in English. Lorenzo, he rejects the 20%. Also, the crows are landing. Right now. Lorenzo didn't flinch. His face remained an unreadable mask, but the muscle in his jaw feathered. He slowly reached for his wine glass, his eyes sweeping the perimeter of the vineyard. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, the faint crunch of tires on gravel echoed over the hills. Salvatore, Lorenzo said, switching to Italian himself, his voice booming over the terrace. Did you invite Silas to our private meeting? Salvatore's eyes widened in genuine surprise. He looked at Matteo, and in that split second, the old Don realized his own son had betrayed him. Matteo had sold out his father's territory to the Rossettis in exchange for a higher seat at the table. Matteo, you fool! Salvatore roared, slamming his fists onto the table. But it was too late. 3 black SUVs tore through the vineyard gates, crushing the ancient grapevines. Doors flew open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, and heavily armed men poured out. At the center of them was Silas Rossetti, a sharp-featured, ruthless man who looked more like a Wall Street banker than a mob boss. Chaos erupted. Get down, Lorenzo shouted, grabbing Chloe by the waist and dragging her behind the heavy oak table just as the first volley of gunfire shattered the carafes of wine above them. Glass and red wine rained down on them like blood. Lorenzo drew his weapon, firing precise, calculated shots over the top of the table. 2 of Silas's men dropped instantly, the Leone guards, confused and suddenly fighting a war on 2 fronts, began returning fire. Matteo tried to run toward Silas's vehicles, but his own brother, Vincent, shot him in the leg, screaming curses in Sicilian about loyalty and treason. We can't stay here, Lorenzo yelled, over the deafening roar of automatic weapons. He pulled a spare magazine from his pocket, reloading with terrifying speed. He looked at Chloe, his eyes burning with a desperate, feral protectiveness. There's a service road behind the farmhouse. When I give the word, you run. Do not look back. My men are waiting a mile down the road. I am not leaving you, Chloe screamed back, her hands covering her ears. You will do exactly as I say, Lorenzo roared, grabbing her face. They want the ledger, Chloe. If they take you, they get the book, and Arthur dies. If you make it to the cars, my men will get you to the jet. Go to New York, get the ledger, and give it to my mother. She will know how to destroy Silas. Before Chloe could argue, Lorenzo stood up, laying down a relentless barrage of cover fire. Go! Now! Tears blurring her vision, Chloe scrambled out from behind the table and sprinted toward the back of the farmhouse. Bullets chipped the stone walls around her, showering her with dust. She didn't look back at the man who had bought her brother's life, the man who had kissed her like the world was ending. She ran until her lungs burned, fleeing through the labyrinth of the Marsala vineyards, praying that the gunfire echoing behind her wouldn't be the last she ever heard of Lorenzo Vitiello. The flight back to New York was a suffocating blur of terror and turbulence. Chloe sat alone in the sprawling cabin of the Vitiello private jet, her hands stained with the dust of the Marsala vineyards and the phantom warmth of Lorenzo's last desperate touch. His men, stoic and terrifyingly silent, had shoved her onto the plane before the local carabinieri or Rossetti's reinforcements could lock down the Palermo airport. She landed at JFK under the cover of a torrential downpour, immediately flanked by 2 Vititello enforcers who escorted her into an armored Cadillac Escalade. They didn't take her to her apartment in Queens. Instead, they drove deep into the heart of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, pulling up to a formidable, ivy-covered brownstone, surrounded by wrought iron gates and men carrying concealed automatic weapons. Caterina Vitiello was waiting in the parlor. The matriarch looked older than she had at the restaurant, the heavy mantle of syndicate warfare visibly pressing down on her shoulders. She stood by a roaring fireplace, her dark eyes locking onto Chloe as she entered. "My son," Caterina demanded, her voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. "Where is my son?" Chloe's throat tightened, fighting back a wave of nausea. "He stayed behind. To give me cover." Silas Rossetti ambushed the meeting. Caterina. Matteo Leone sold him out. Caterina closed her eyes, a sharp, ragged breath escaping her lips. For a fleeting second, she was just a mother terrified for her child. Then, the iron facade slammed back into place. "And the ledger?" Lorenzo called me from the armored car before the meeting. He said Thomas Bennett's daughter held the key to Silas Rossetti's coffin. "I need to go to a Chase Manhattan branch on 5th Avenue, Chloe said, her voice steadying as the adrenaline flared back to life. "The key to the safety deposit box is sewn into the lining of my father's old winter coat at my apartment, but your men wouldn't let me stop." Caterina nodded sharply. "We go together. Silas will have eyes on your building." Within the hour, a convoy of black vehicles descended upon Queens. Vitiello soldiers swept the trashed apartment while Chloe rushed to her bedroom closet, tearing the lining of a heavy wool peacoat. A small, brass key dropped into her palm. By mid-afternoon, under the watchful eyes of heavily armed guards, Chloe stood in the sterile vault of the bank, retrieving a heavy, black, leather-bound notebook. Back in the safety of the Bensonhurst compound, they laid the book on a massive mahogany dining table. Caterina opened it, her brow furrowing. "It's gibberish, lines of numbers mixed with Cyrillic letters and Sicilian slang." "It's not gibberish," Chloe murmured, pulling up a chair. "It's a polyalphabetic cipher. My father used a mix of Neapolitan dialect and Russian bratva shorthand. He taught me the root key when I was 16, pretending it was a puzzle game. For 6 agonizing hours, while the fate of Lorenzo Vitiello remained a dark, terrifying mystery across the Atlantic, Chloe worked. She translated page after page of her father's meticulous records. The ledger was a devastating weapon. It detailed Silas Rossetti's entire money laundering network, exposing hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, massive real estate shell companies in Manhattan, and, most fatally, millions of dollars in bribes paid to a corrupt federal magistrate, Judge Harrison Foley. "This is it," Caterina whispered, tracing a manicured fingernail over the translated names. "Silas's power comes from his money and his political protection. Without them, his own capos will turn on him." "Then let's take it all," Chloe said, a fierce, unforgiving fire burning in her chest. She was no longer just a frightened waitress. She was Thomas Bennett's daughter, fighting for the man who had risked everything to save her. Caterina unleashed the full bureaucratic might of the Vitiello empire. Encrypted files were anonymously routed to the FBI's Organized Crime Division, specifically targeting the agents investigating Judge Foley. Simultaneously, Katerina's financial fixers initiated a series of coordinated cyber attacks on Rossetti's shell companies, freezing his localized assets and exposing his offshore holdings to federal scrutiny. By midnight, the New York underworld was in absolute chaos. Silas Rossetti's empire was collapsing in real time, but there was still no word from Sicily. At 2 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the parlor burst open. Chloe shot to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the doorway, supported by his head of security, was Lorenzo. He looked like he had walked through hell. His black suit was torn and stained with dried blood. A crude bandage was wrapped tightly around his left shoulder, and his face was bruised and exhausted, but his dark eyes were blazing with a lethal, triumphant light. "Lorenzo!" Katerina cried out, rushing forward to grip his face, speaking rapid, tearful Sicilian prayers. Lorenzo kissed his mother's forehead gently, but his eyes never left Chloe. He gently pushed past the guards, walking toward her with a slow, deliberate limp. "I told you," Lorenzo rasped, his voice rough and broken. "I would not break my vow to you." Tears spilled over Chloe's cheeks. She didn't care about the blood, the danger, or the syndicate politics. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. Lorenzo let out a sharp hiss of pain from his wounded shoulder, but his right arm wrapped around her waist with crushing, possessive force, anchoring her to him. "You're alive," she sobbed into his ruined shirt. "Silas. We destroyed his ledgers. Katerina and I ruined him." "I know," Lorenzo murmured, resting his chin on the top of her head. Silas tried to flee Sicily when his accounts froze. My men intercepted him at the Palermo docks. "The Rossetti family is finished. Arthur is safe. You are safe." He pulled back slightly, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, wiping away a tear with his thumb. He looked down at the heavy emerald ring still resting on her finger. It had been a prop, a piece of armor for a dangerous performance. "I bought your brother's debt," Lorenzo said softly, the chaotic noise of the room seeming to fade into absolute silence. "And I told you that you belonged to me until it was paid. But I was wrong." Chloe's breath hitched. "Lorenzo, you don't belong to me, Chloe," he whispered, his dark eyes dropping to her lips. "I belong to you. You didn't just translate a ledger. You translated the darkest parts of my world, and you didn't run. So, the fake engagement is over." Before the panic could register in her chest, Lorenzo dropped to one knee, ignoring the agonizing pain in his shoulder. He took her trembling hand, his grip warm and absolute. "Marry me," the Mafia boss demanded, though for the first time in his life, it wasn't a command, it was a plea. "For real this time. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that the heart you stole at that restaurant is entirely yours." Chloe looked down at the ruthless, beautiful man kneeling before her, the man who had burned down an empire just to keep her safe. She smiled, her voice thick with emotion as she replied in the flawless Italian that had started it all. "Si, per sempre." Yes. Forever. Gunfire fades, replaced by the quiet clinking of crystal inside a heavily guarded Brooklyn brownstone. What started as a desperate translation transformed into an unbreakable syndicate dynasty. Chloe Bennett didn't merely save her brother's life. She permanently rewrote the modern underworld's brutal rulebook alongside Lorenzo Vitiello. Their vast empire currently rests not on inherited violence, but upon the loyalty and a love forged in survival.